And then you have Paul quoting Luke's gospel in his letter to the Corinthian church. You have him quoting it in his letter to Timothy. It was clear that Luke's gospel is available early enough, and it was
Yeah.
considered scripture.
So the evidence is so important. I'd love for us to sort of put that in context here in the book, like walk through some of the evidence that you present in the book. For example, one of the things that I've encountered online quite a bit is if you quote the New Testament, particularly the Gospels, people come on and say, oh, that wasn't written by eyewitnesses. It was written way too late to be eyewitnesses. And you address that in the book. And I'd love for our viewers and listeners to be able to be equipped with some information on that topic. So what do we say to people when they say, oh, these weren't eyewitnesses, it was just they were all too late, and
Right.
something like
Well,
that?
let's think about this. In the 2,000-year history of Christianity, when do you think that statement, these were written too late to have been written by eyewitnesses, when do you think that was probably first uttered? It wasn't uttered in the first 1,800 years of the faith system. This is a relatively new claim. And that's why you need to address it, because what I try to do in the book is give you the 4 legs of reliable eyewitness testimony. Were they written, or was a witness really there to see what they said they saw? Can they be corroborated in some way? Do they change their story over time? And finally, do they possess a bias or a motive to lie? So those are the 4 things we allow jurors to think about when they're assessing eyewitnesses. And that first question, were they really there to see what they said they saw, comes down to, were these written early enough to have been written by eyewitnesses, these gospels? Because the best thing you could do if you want to lie about Jesus is just wait till everyone who knows the truth is dead. Then you can say whatever you want about Jesus. So
Yeah.
if these are late, you have a better chance of telling the story. But one thing for sure, they cannot even begin to qualify as eyewitness accounts if they're written in the 2nd century. So the question is, are these written in the 1st century? I think there's many good reasons to believe they are, and I kind of lay them out in a timeline in one of the chapters of the book, just to make the case that this is early enough. All the Gospels are lacking the elements that would clearly have been in the Gospels had they been written in the 2nd century. And there is no good manuscript reason to believe that they were written in the 2nd century. When you ask people, like, what is the foundation upon which these critics would say this is written late? Is it because they've got some manuscript evidence that demonstrates they are written? No. And I talked about this with Dan Wallace, who's not a relative of mine, but he's another scholar. And I said, what do you think is the main, like, he is really aware of all the manuscript evidence because his ministry photographs the manuscripts. And so I wanted to know, was there some like evidential reason? No, it's based on 2 things. Number one, what's one thing? It's a bias against the supernatural. Because when you have a prediction of a prophetic utterance of Jesus in the Gospels, which predicts the destruction of the temple, which we know occurred in 70 AD, well, then skeptics are going to say, well, then clearly it was written after 70 AD. Well, why? Because they don't believe that anyone could actually predict such a thing. That would be supernatural, and I've got a bias against the supernatural. Therefore, I've got to date it post 70, even though there's a lot of other good evidence in the Gospels and in the book of Acts that puts it pre 70. Don't care. There's no way he could have accurately predicted that. Not only that, if you're suggesting that somehow this had to be written after eyewitnesses were dead, because there are tons of miracles described on the pages of the New Testament, and we know those didn't happen because we have a bias against the supernatural.
Right.
So therefore, they must have been written after everyone's dead. But that bias is that's the tail that wags the dog, called late dating. So I think in the end, we have to ask the question, well, do we have any good evidence? And I think the stuff that's missing in the book of Acts is dramatic. That book of Acts is missing the deaths of all the major players in the book of Acts are not mentioned, even though Luke mentions the death of James, the brother of John. Okay, that is a nobody in terms of who people were in the 1st century in Christianity. Yeah, he was one of the disciples, but he dies in 44. You don't have anything mentioned in that book about the death of James, the brother of Jesus, who ran the largest church in the world at the time in Jerusalem, was the chief leader of the first Christian council ever held in Acts chapter 15, I think it is. So he was a bigwig, and spectacular death missing. That was in 61. There's no death of Peter. Should be like, he's somebody. No death of Paul is mentioned. You mentioned the death of James, the brother of, and Stephen. Those are mentioned, but not the death of James, the brother of Jesus, Peter, not even Barnabas. Barnabas dies in 61. That death's not mentioned. These are people who had major roles to play in the story. No description of the temple being destroyed in 60. No description of the siege of Jerusalem. There are good reasons to believe that that book is written before the first missing piece, which would put it around 60. And then, of course, you have him writing the Gospel of Luke earlier. He says that in his first chapter of Acts. So that means that's before 60. And then you have Paul quoting Luke's Gospel in his letter to the Corinthian church. You have him quoting it in his letter to Timothy. It was clear that Luke's Gospel is available early enough, and it was considered scripture when he's writing to Timothy, and was cited as authoritative as early as the earliest years of the 50s in the book he wrote to the Corinthians. There's good reason to believe these are written early. And that was always the claim of Christendom. That was always the belief of Christendom. It's not as though people in the second century were saying, these new gospels we have, it's like there's no evidence in recorded history which suggests late dating. It's a bias against the supernatural that wags the dog.
Yeah, that blew my mind when I read that about Luke's gospel being considered scripture. And even there's, I think, in maybe 1st or 2nd Peter referencing Paul's letters on par with scripture. That was mind-blowing to know that that's right there in the New Testament. It's so cool. Yeah. Now, I wonder if a skeptic might say, okay, well, you've said that they would have mentioned certain deaths, they would have mentioned the destruction of Jerusalem, but isn't that an argument from silence? How would you approach a skeptic who might say that?
Yes, absolutely. It's an argument from silence. The question is supported by anything else? So the argument from silence in the book of Acts is supported by the argument that's not silent, the quoting of Luke's gospel in both the letters of Paul to the Corinthian church and to Timothy. So it's not just that and also it's true that Paul's letters, nobody doubts, by the way, like even Bart Ehrman does not doubt that Paul's letter to the Corinthians is written in the early 50s. And that claim in 1 Corinthians 15 includes the earliest claims about Jesus and the resurrection. You're not going to get away. There's no way to ditch this idea that again, I'm not always, this is my bias, okay? I'm not always interested in the same things that Christians are interested in when I was first examining the scriptures. Like inerrancy was not something I was after. Now, today, do I believe in yes, I believe in inerrancy, but back then I didn't care. I just needed to know, is this outline, was the claim in general being made early? Yes, it was. If you're going to argue that somehow nobody talked about a resurrected Christ until the 2nd century, you're just out of your mind. It's not the case. And that's the most outrageous claim about Christianity, was that Christ rose from the grave. And that claim is very, very early in history. As a matter of fact, Gary Habermas has probably done the best, and you've had him on your show, has done the best in terms of tracing back those earliest claims.
Yeah.
And you trace back through Galatians, you trace back through the book of Acts. You can see, when did Paul have the road to Damascus vision? When did he then meet with the disciples? What did they tell him? How early was this claim being made in history? Well, he can trace it back, I think, to within about 3 years of the actual event. And that is good enough for me. Now, if you said, well, all these details, though, well, okay, what I'm most concerned about was somebody saying that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the grave. That's what I'm most concerned about.
Yeah.
They said, afterwards he had a pizza or he had an apple pie. Do I really care? The claim is he rose from the grave.
Yeah.
That's enough for me to start taking this seriously. And that's really how I started.